Today we sit down with clinical psychologist Sikander Kalla as he helps us to navigate through stigma and its associated stereotypes. Sikander, welcome back to The Loft.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Now, Sikander, as we break down what stigma is and prejudices are, do we still live in an era of stigma and prejudice revolving around certain contracted illnesses, such as HIV, for example, and why?
Most certainly. I think we've come a long way with regard to managing the HIV/AIDS epidemic that we've had in South Africa. But I do think that we still have a strong social stigma prevalence that goes around. More specifically, when it comes to what are the connotations of contracting the illness. Yeah. I think what happens is we add value-based judgments, we add stereotypical ways of thinking when it comes to contracting an illness like HIV/AIDS. And I think, even if you look back at the history of HIV/AIDS, where it was previously called GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, in which there was a negative connotation of homosexuality. And I think over the years, as we moved beyond that connotation, we started viewing it more as a sign of promiscuity, reckless sexual behavior. And I think that then carries its own stigma with regard to how we navigate through social settings, the cultural underpinnings, moral structures. And I think it's important for us to then think about how we perpetuate that stigma by also integrating ways of thinking that perhaps do not fit the context in which we find ourselves in now, where we know people may contract the illness not from reckless sexual behavior, but more even in committed exclusive monogamous relationships. So I think it's really a place in which we need to think a bit more open-mindedly about it.
Absolutely. But now, if we do decide to engage within this box-type thinking, what are some of the consequences of thinking in such judgmental ways?
Well, most certainly to go back to stereotypes. I think at the end of the day, when you hear someone's got the illness, the immediate stereotype is were they sexually irresponsible, what is at play here? Are they a promiscuous individual? Is they maybe like a needle stick from drug use? There's all of these particular things that go through one's mind. And I think we need to move beyond that and say, hey, could there be something else at play? Are we thinking in narrow-minded ways that maybe historically were perpetuated for a particular reason? But at the time we find ourselves in, we need to start thinking in broader ways. And I think it's moving beyond those stereotypes, moving beyond those rigid ways of thinking, seeing if we can find a way in which we integrate an understanding of people contracting the illness without judgment.
So then what are some of the tips and advice when deciding to open up about some of these challenges?
So what I would say with regard to the tips for the individual first is for you to first become comfortable with your diagnosis, for you to get through that phase in which you're going through all the motions of disappointment, shock, and to get to the point of acceptance with it internally, so that there's already an internal comfort that is not out of bounds and does not make the conversation that much more difficult. I then think, on the other hand, more from a societal perspective, it shouldn't just be placed on the individual alone, but I think we all have a responsibility to make ourselves more informed about specific illnesses, specifically ones that are quite prevalent in our society. I'm really happy with the point that you touched on about it extends to multiple illnesses. We find ourselves in a time now of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is an illness that one can contract from another person. And I think people that are not informed might not understand the clinical protocols and guidelines that if you quarantine for 10 days, it is assumed that you are now out of the contagious phase of the illness. And people then still hold the stigma and this reluctance to associate themselves with someone who may have contracted the illness out of an irrational fear of potentially getting infected. And I think those irrational fears may be dissipated the more informed we are as a society, the more we put in the work to do the research to make sure we're educated on such topics.
Absolutely. Now, Sikander, let's just broaden the conversation here. What can we do then as individuals and, as you've already placed, broader society to break down the cycle of stigma and facilitate healthy conversations around these issues?
I think first and foremost, creating spaces in which we have open dialogue in a non-judgmental way. And I think as you know, the youth demographic, we've become quite innovative with that, like hosting discussions and being able to open up and resonate with individuals that share similar experiences. I think that already normalizes what we're going through. And through normalizing that, we start feeling a bit more comfortable to open up. I think from a societal perspective, we've gone a long way with the pre-test and post-test counseling. And I think to also make sure that our practitioners have a certain sensitivity to how those discussions happen. And I think we've become sensitized to know that those are issues that we deal with in communities. And I think it's important then from all the way up from government to say, hey, let's make sure the training is adequate for our practitioners, and from practitioners themselves to say, hey, bedside manner, good sensitivity around discussing these issues, and also for families and cultures to integrate an understanding of, at the end of the day, you are someone who's suffering from an illness rather than you are the illness.
Absolutely.
To be able to say that we're not going to touch utensils or what have you that you've touched is irrational, and it's rooted in a misunderstanding of the illness.
Thank you so much, clinical psychologist Sikander Kalla, helping us break down stigmas and prejudice. Goodbye.
Thank you.
South Africa, please do head over to our social media platforms and let us know your thoughts on the topic. Use the hashtag #AfternoonExpress in all of your comments.